Right now we're going to take a look at the first, well, really 1,200 years of Korean history. We're actually going to go all the way back to 2333 BC. But in terms of verifiable history, we're looking at about the first 1,200 years of a Korean state and society. So we're going to look at the political, cultural, religious foundations of what would later develop into medieval Korea, which would later develop into modern Korea. So we're going to look at a very, very broad amount of time, and we're going to try to hit the high points so that we can have a political narrative established, so that in the following video we can talk a little bit more about, in detail, about some of the kings and queens. Because this is very unfamiliar information to most students, we're going to kind of just give a general outline of the development of Korean states and ultimately the unification of Korea under the Shilla Kingdom. We cannot talk about Korean history without talking about nationalism, because Korea's history has been more impacted by modern politics than perhaps the history of any country that we're going to look at during this course. First thing to point out, looking at a map of East Asia, you can see that Korea is sandwiched between two very powerful societies. You have the vast empire of China in the various dynasties throughout history on one side. On the other side, you have the islands of Japan. And there are periods in which a polity inside the Korean peninsula is at war with either China or Japan. For example, the 16th century, you have the Imjin War between the Japanese samurai and Korea. In the earlier periods that we're going to talk about more today, the fighting is with first Han and then Dong China. So being sandwiched between these two very powerful nations has resulted in an independent streak in Korean society, a strong urge to define Korea separately from its neighbors, to emphasize what is uniquely Korean, to focus on Korea's independence and autonomy. And there is a very zealous movement among historians to guard Korea's historical legacy and historical patrimony and to promote its autonomy. Now, I'll say this. From 1910 to 1945, Korea was occupied by Japan. It was a very hated occupation. It's one that's still very controversial to discuss in Korea today. As a result, an upsurge in Korean nationalism in both Koreas complicates the history. On top of that, you have the difference between North and South, with North and South taking very different approaches on the history of the entire peninsula, seeing as how these were not divided cultures in a previous period. So while there have always been cultural distinctions between North and South in Korea, and there have even been political divisions inside Korea, the current manifestation of North and South Korea, this is a modern post-World War II Cold War phenomenon that still exists to the present day. And Southern and Northern scholars do not agree about the history of Korea. The fights between the two can become very dramatic, and it really does complicate how the history of Korea is presented to the world. And we're going to talk about this as we go through our narrative of the first 1,000 years of Korean history. One early example of this is the figure of Dongun. And Dongun is kind of the mythological founder of Korea. He's very similar to Yu the Great of the Xia dynasty, if you recall from an earlier lecture. There may be some historical basis to Dongun, but the historicity of Dongun has never been proven, and many cultures have mythological founders. We talked about Yu the Great. There is, for example, Romulus and Remus in ancient Rome, if you've ever heard of those figures. Right? So many cultures have founders that for whom we can't establish a historical record. And Dongun is one of them. In fact, he's very, very similar to Yu the Great in that he teaches people writing, he teaches people how to obey laws, he teaches people how to farm correctly, how to maintain flood control, really all of the basic fundamental aspects of civilization. Traditionally, Korean scholars argued that these were taught to the Korean people by Dongun. Now, modern South Korean scholars generally acknowledge that Dongun is a kind of at least a semi-mythological figure. There may have been an historical Dongun, but his achievements in his life, if he did in fact exist, have been kind of blown way out of proportion, and he's become this kind of legendary figure, teaching people how to fashion items out of bronze, weapons, tools, etc. In North Korea, scholars treat Dongun as if he were a bona fide historical figure, and from the North Korean point of view, this is an inassailable position. Dongun was a real king. He really invented almost every aspect of civilization completely on his own. Civilization originating first with the Korean people and spreading into China, and from China into the western parts of Eurasia. From the North Korean perspective, the official teaching is that civilization was created in Korea. And so Dongun is this great super genius who lived and who essentially created civilized society all by himself. So Dongun was said to have founded the kingdom of Gosojeon. When we say Gosojeon, that just means old Joseon, to compare it to its late medieval Joseon, which is a much, much later kingdom by the same name, another Korean kingdom. In South Korea, Dongun is considered a mythological figure. Generally, Gosojeon in its early history, from the South Korean point of view, was a clan-based society where people were divided into tribal units, and these tribal units had their own chieftains who would then elect a king, who would then rule over the kind of unified kingdom, primarily concerned with maintaining the agricultural system and engaging in state ritual. We don't have written records of Gosojeon, though, is the problem. We have archaeological remnants, remains from this kingdom, but we don't have any written records. We start getting verifiable written records in which figures are written about during the time in which they lived with the ascension of Waemon in Korea. And Waemon was a Chinese general from the Yan Kingdom in northeastern China. He invaded Gosojeon, conquered it, and set himself up as ruler in 194 BC, at kind of the height of the Western Han Dynasty. So Waemon establishes himself as the king of Gosojeon. So we call this period of time in which he and his descendants ruled Waemon Gosojeon. And Waemon Gosojeon was a Korean society ruled by a Han Chinese elite. The legal system that had been established by Gojoseon, by the tribal kings orally, the 8 precepts, was still in existence after the establishment of Waemon Gosojeon, but Waemon began to insert aspects of Confucian teaching and the Confucian imperial system into Korean society. So we start to see the Sinicization, or the Chineseification of Korean society. So, but it's important to note that even though Gosojeon, the people in Gosojeon, were adapting to Chinese culture, which was being imposed on them from the top down, Chinese language, Chinese writing system, Chinese form of government, they still maintained their own independent culture and were often in rebellion against Waemon, and particularly against his grandson. So in 108 BC, Han Emperor Wu Di, and this is why it's so important that we spent so much time on the Han Dynasty, because it radiates out into all of the other cultures we're going to talk about in this course. Han Wu Di decides that he cannot leave the Chinese-ruled Weimar Gosojeon kingdom intact. There is a threat that they will ally with the Xiongnu, the horse nomads who are trying to break through the Great Wall and raid northern China. He's concerned that Weimon's grandson is going to ally with the Xiongnu, Chan Yu, the kind of the great chieftain, and this will be a serious problem for the Han Dynasty in the north. So he sends his armies into Korea, and they take the kingdom of Gosojeon, they destroy it, and they split it up into 4 commanderies, 4 administrative divisions. So the Korean chieftains were now forced to pay tribute to the Han Emperor Wu Di. The end result of this political arrangement was that you have Chinese culture, Han culture, spreading into the Korean peninsula at an astounding rate. We start to see young Korean scholars educated in the Confucian tradition. We start to see Han tomb ornaments, jade carvings, bronze vessels, weaponry, all beginning to mimic the style of Han China, because they're being introduced into a culture that is much less materially wealthy, much less politically sophisticated through the Han heartland. So this particular arrangement has been the subject of a lot of contention for many who are strong Korean nationalists. The fact that so much of Korean art and writing from this period of time originates from Han China, this is a very controversial subject. Most historians and archaeologists from South Korea acknowledge that these 4 commanderies are, in this period of time, very, very influential on Korean culture. But in North Korea, there is an entirely different theory that the commanderies that are spoken about in the Han Chinese sources and in the Korean sources actually are in the Liaodong Peninsula. They're not actually in Korea, according to North Korean scholars. That North Korea was completely independent of Chinese rule the entire time, that they were never conquered, and that all of the Han-style tomb objects, the Han-style saddles, bridles, all of the artifacts that we associate with the Han Dynasty were won over through trade, and that they weren't even predominant within the Korean peninsula. Right? That native styles always held precedence. Right? So, in fact, this is the official position in North Korea, and if you go against this theory, you can find yourself in a great amount of trouble, as has happened before. So there is a massive dispute between the 2 Koreas on the Han Chinese influence, and the role of China in Korean history will be something that scholars will have to contend with even up into the present day. China played a major role in the Korean War of the 1950s, and in North Korean historiography, the Chinese role has largely been completely written out of the narrative. So this is a recurring pattern, a recurring conflict in Korean history. There is a definite drive to insist on the nativeness of many of the cultural developments, some of the forms of architecture, art, writing, even Confucian philosophy that we'll talk about later on. When the Yellow Turban or Yellow Scarves Rebellion broke out in 184 in China, 184 AD, the central authority was racked with rebellion and strife. As a result, you see a withdrawal of Imperial Chinese forces from the 4 commanderies in what's now northern North Korea. When these forces pulled out, they created a power vacuum that would ultimately end up being filled by 3 very powerful kingdoms who would go back and forth, warring with each other, allying with each other for a very, very long period of about 400 years before one would completely conquer the peninsula. So we call this period the Three Kingdoms period, just as we had a Three Kingdoms period in China, where China was divided between Wei, Wu, and Shuhan. We now have a Korean Three Kingdoms period, where Korea is divided by Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, and Shilla in the southeast. Now, there's also a very small confederacy in between the southern portion of Baekje and Shilla, but we're not going to discuss them in detail because they were never militarily ascendant. So the first kingdom we're going to talk about is Goguryeo, because Goguryeo directly filled the power vacuum left by the removal of Han troops. Goguryeo was very militarily powerful because the kingdom had to be. They were faced not only with a renewed threat from China once reunification occurred after the end of the Three Kingdoms period with the Jin dynasty and later the Sui dynasty. They also had to fight against the various tribes that lived north of the Great Wall and raided into China. They would occasionally turn their sights on Goguryeo as well and raid into northern Korea. The founder of Goguryeo is an at least semi-mythical figure. In other words, we're not sure of the truth of his existence. The ancient chronicles mention him. He was believed to have been a historical figure throughout the pre-modern period. His name was Dongmyong, but he would later take the title of Jumong, which means skilled archer. Now, don't worry about remembering these names. Most of these names, they're not, they're very alien to most students, so I'm not going to expect you to have them completely memorized or anything. But Jumong was a great archer who was supposedly the son of a sky god and a river goddess. And he, just like with Yu the Great and with Dangun, he's kind of this semi-mythical figure. There was an event in which he was attempting to cross a river, and fish and turtles came up out of the river so that he could walk across, right, and go and do battle. Nonetheless, Goguryeo was a very militant kingdom from the beginning, and they had to be because of their situation, as their geographic location, as I mentioned earlier. And I'd also like to take time to point out that for many Koreans, in the perception of many, these were, in fact, historical figures. And, for example, this is an image from I believe it was 2006 televised drama about Jumong. So even if these are not necessarily historically viable figures, they're still important culturally. In fact, there's a lot of dispute about the national identity of Goguryeo because genetic testing from tombs has revealed a large presence of Han Chinese genetics. So there's dispute with many in China claiming that Goguryeo was a kind of colony of China. And of course, for Koreans, this very powerful kingdom is very much part of their own tradition. So there's a lot of back and forth disputation when it comes to modern politics. Nonetheless, Goguryeo was a very militarily powerful kingdom that was real, that had real powerful leaders, and was very, very defiant in battling its neighbors. I'd like to take a minute to talk about something in which Goguryeo was very, very influential worldwide. So in the late Roman Empire, both the late Western Empire and late Eastern Empire, you had the development of a type of fighter called a cataphract. The cataphract was the basis for the medieval European knight. A cataphract was a horseman who was heavily armored, usually in some kind of scale or lamellar armor. And not only was the warrior armored, the horse was armored. So they had a shield, sometimes a lance, sometimes a mace. They tended to love maces because when you're on horseback and you're riding someone down and you hit someone with the mace doesn't get stuck in the enemy soldier, so you don't end up dragging the enemy behind you, and you can continue your advance. These were very, very powerful shock troops. When we say shock troops, we mean troops designed to break enemy formations, literally to run over people, right? So you would have these massed formations of cataphractoi, and they would smash into the enemy line, crush the formation, and hopefully rout the enemy. Cataphracts were very popular towards the end of the Roman Empire. They were popular in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire also, as it's known as. Afterwards, they were popular in Persia, and the Mongols also used them. But the first cataphractoi, the first heavily armored horsemen, where both the horse and the warrior were completely covered in armor. The horse wasn't completely covered in armor, but its vitals were. Came from Goguryeo. Goguryeo was the first army in the history of the world to employ this type of ultra heavily armored shock cavalrymen. And they were very effective at this. The reason for this is that they had a wide amount of territory that they would have to patrol. But they didn't have a large population. So their warriors had to be able to endure battle. They would have to ride from region to region, dealing with incursions from many different directions. Goguryeo was very militarily dominant. The kingdom enjoyed a series of strong leaders. They expanded into Manchuria. They battled the Xianbei, kind of the successors to the Xiongnu. They battled the various powers coming from northern China during a period of Chinese disunity. But they still attempted to absorb as much Chinese culture as possible. And you can see this in the tomb murals that they left behind, like this one of a serpent and a turtle that are a common motif throughout East Asia, the turtle being a very, very prominent symbol. So they were still taking in Chinese culture, despite the fact that they were also fighting for their independence. So even though there was conflict with China, there was also cultural exchange. And one thing I should point out, this motif of the turtle, both turtles and tortoises in the ancient East Asia, they were both seen as belonging to the same family of creature. These turtles, they are symbols of longevity. And so the idea is that seeing a turtle is a great sign, it's a great omen that you're going to live a long life. And this is because turtles, particularly larger ones, do tend to live considerable amounts of time. On top of this, they were seen, because of their great age, as kind of symbols of wisdom and, most importantly, of good fortune. So people would attempt to cover their homes in paintings of turtles, carved objects resembling turtles, bronze urns that resembled turtles. And this is something that began in China and spread throughout East Asia into Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Tibet, etc. And we can see that here in Goguryeo, this Chinese-style tomb mural. And these tomb murals, just like all the other aspects of Korean culture, early Korean culture that we've talked about, there's a lot of conflict. How much comes from the outside? How much was native genius? So what I've said is controversial. Right? The fact that these tomb murals, that they're a style borrowed from China. Right? That's something that not all Korean scholars are going to agree with. But from my point of view, it's pretty clear that these are Chinese influenced. But that's not to say that ancient Korea didn't have its own identity. In fact, they did, and they resisted the Chinese generation after generation, despite taking aspects of Chinese culture like Confucianism, art forms, etc. The greatest ruler of Goguryeo was Gwanggaeto the Great, who lived at the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century AD. He was very militarily powerful. You can see this image of here. He's in his lamellar armor. Right? This is a later image from from the early modern period, 16th, 17th century, I believe. But nonetheless, the armor is accurate. He would wear lamellar armor, just like all of the great cataphracts. Lamellar armor is a style of armor that originated in China, where you would have kind of leather, hardened leather or metal plates, tiny plates sewn onto a cloth, usually wool, and that would be worn as armor in battle, and it was very flexible despite being very sturdy. This would eventually spread into Europe and become the basis for the Roman armor, the lorica segmentata, the armor that's used by the Roman legions that has the plates. And so this allows a great amount of protection while the wearer can move very effectively despite not weighing very much. Right? So it really was something that it would be used into the early modern period. But Guangeto did not reign for very long. He only reigned for 22 years, and during that period of time, he defeated the other two kingdoms, the other two great kingdoms of Korea, not decisively. He didn't wipe them out, but he checked their power and brought them under his sway, and he also defeated the nomadic tribes invading from the ruined northern China. So Guangeto expanded Goguryeo into the height of its power. Now, should take a moment to mention Goguryeo. This is the origin of the exonym Korean. Right? We are Korea. An exonym is a name given to a group of people by foreigners that is then adopted by a different group of foreigners. For example, the name Sioux, right? The Sioux Confederation, the American Indian Confederation in the Dakotas and in Wyoming that battled the federal government in the later 19th century. The word Sioux means snake in the language of the Crow. The Crow gave the Sioux that name, and because the Crow were allies of the federal government, that's what the federal government referred to them as. Now, the actual Sioux referred to themselves as Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, right? But that name came to American settlers by way of their American Indian allies, the Crow, right? And it's the same kind of thing with the word Korea, right? It was not what the people referred to themselves as. Right? The people referred to Korea as Joseon, right? So Joseon and Gojoseon for old Korea, Korean old Korea. And of course, I'm talking about antiquity and in the Middle Ages. The modern Koreans refer to Korea, the whole of the peninsula, as Hangguk. So, and again, don't worry about being able to pronounce these names. Don't worry about even remembering the specifics. As long as you get the overall picture, right, you can always come back to the videos and look or reference the book and get the specifics. These are very alien names, again, to many people, so they aren't going to be, they're not accessible. I'm trying to make this as accessible as I can, but it's not exactly accessible information to many people in Western societies. Now let's turn to the second of the three great kingdoms, Baekje in the southwest. Baekje was less militarily dominant than Goguryeo, but they were more economically productive. Baekje had most of Korea's metalworkers, its artisans, its artists, and it was a very intellectually and artistically refined kingdom. This is the kingdom in which most Buddhist scholarship was conducted, in which most prominent Buddhist temples were created. In fact, it would be monks from Baekje who would spread Buddhism into Japan and eventually creating the Toji Temple, which I'll show you here. Baekje on land was the militarily weakest of the three kingdoms. However, Baekje also had a very powerful navy. This is due to the fact that the kingdom was engaged in maritime trade with Japan and China, and as a result, a powerful fleet was necessary to provide security for merchants.